while by 2027, the Chinese military might actually have most of the equipment that they would need to undertake what would be a very difficult operation. They're still not sure that they've, so to speak, got the software right. The personnel, the military training, the ability to put together complex, integrated joint operations, logistics, all of these things. I think they have reservations still about their own capabilities in this regard.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're talking to a man with more than 3 decades experience in the British intelligence service MI6. Nigel Inkster was Assistant Chief and Director of Operations and Intelligence when he retired in 2006. He's worked in China and written extensively about it and is the Senior Advisor for China and Cybersecurity at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Welcome to Frontline, Nigel Inkster. Thank you so much for your time. The Foreign Aid Bill, which passed in the US, includes $2 billion towards the foreign military financing program for Taiwan and other security partners. China says it's pushing the island into a dangerous situation. Is it? And how might China respond?
Well, this is a situation that's been going on for some time, and the $2 billion you just referred to is simply the latest installment in a very substantial series of aid packages that the United States has provided to Taiwan in recent years. When the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, they canceled a bilateral treaty with Taiwan that effectively required them to provide security for Taiwan, but they introduced to Taiwan another act which committed the US government to providing Taiwan with military equipment for defensive purposes. That was something that didn't cause, obviously China was not happy with it, but it didn't really cause too much problem. I think the issue came into stark relief around 2017, 2018 under the Trump administration, which began to use Taiwan as a means of putting pressure on China and creating irritation. The Trump administration, I think, provided in total $18 billion worth of military assistance to Taiwan, though it must be said that because of delivery lags, a lot of that equipment hasn't arrived yet. And the Biden administration has similarly provided a range of military equipment to Taiwan. So this $2 billion really is the most recent installment. And in a sense, I think we can say that China's objections to this latest tranche are, in some senses, pro forma. But what I think they will do is to continue and perhaps intensify what they've already been doing for 6 or 7 years now, which is an intensification of what have been termed gray zone tactics. Flights over the so-called median line, the sort of midway line in the Taiwan Strait that divides the two entities, a lot of military exercises, naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan, cyber attacks, information operations, cognition warfare. All of these things have been going on. And
it's widely regarded, though, that China would be militarily ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. How far is it prepared to go, in your opinion, to exert its claim over the island?
That, in a sense, when they say that they are prepared to resort to military force to recover the island, one has to take this seriously. At the same time, it's quite clear that for now, at least, the Chinese government is more focused on peaceful reunification with Taiwan. This is not straightforward because the party that has governed Taiwan for the last 8 years and will continue to do so when the presidential handover takes place later this month, have been regarded by China as promoting Taiwan independence, which for China has always been a red line. But in the recent elections in Taiwan that took place in January this year, we saw a situation in which the Democratic People's Party, the DPP, the governing party, retained the presidency but lost control of the legislature, with a lot of people splitting their votes precisely in order to bring about this outcome. So I think China will look at the political situation in Taiwan and think, well, if the two main opposition parties had done what they set out to do and agreed on a unity candidate, which ultimately failed to materialize, they would actually have won the election. And at least one of these parties, the Kuomintang, the KMT, is much more amenable, at least to talking to China about reunification, whereas, of course, the DPP is not. The other thing, to pick up on what you said about China being militarily ready by 2027 to take Taiwan, I think we need to make a distinction here between capability and intent. On the one hand, and secondly, to recognize that while by 2027 the Chinese military might actually have most of the equipment that they would need to undertake what would be a very difficult operation, they're still not sure that they've, so to speak, got the software right. The personnel, the military training, the ability to put together complex integrated joint operations, logistics, all of these things. I think they have reservations still about their own capabilities in this regard.
Your assessment right now is that China does not have the intent. It wants to achieve its ambitions via diplomatic means without violence at this stage.
Yes, I mean, when China looks at the whole Taiwan situation, their military planning is based on a presumption that the United States will come to Taiwan's aid militarily in the event of conflict. The United States posture has been one of strategic ambiguity, leaving it open whether or not they would undertake such activity. But President Biden has, in the last couple of years, said on 4 occasions that the US would come to Taiwan's assistance in such an event. So I think you've got to take that seriously. And of course, China obviously is concerned about the very real risks of getting into a shooting war with the United States. It's not necessarily the case that they would lose this war, but equally, it's not necessarily the case they would win it. Wars these days tend not to have quick and decisive conclusions. And what China could find itself getting into is a prolonged conflict of uncertain outcome. And I think Xi Jinping and any eventual successor, if it doesn't happen under Xi Jinping, would be very concerned about the impact of that on the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to retain its hold on power. Not to mention the...
What do you make then of reports that have been in a British national newspaper this week that China is stockpiling gold? It's raised suspicions that this is perhaps sanction-proofing itself against the US. What do you read into that?
Possible, but I think you have to remember that the Chinese Communist Party is a quintessentially paranoid organization and kind of needs to be. This is in their DNA, so to speak. And for a long time now, Xi Jinping has been talking to the Chinese people about the need for struggle, the need to be aware of threats. He has identified over 20 areas which apply to national security. Just recently, China had its National Security Day when they seek to raise the awareness of the population about the threats that China faces. Xi Jinping has also talked about a very much more difficult and complex international situation. The United States government is now threatening to sanction some Chinese banks who are seen as having facilitated the sale of to Russia of equipment that Russia is using to rebuild its military capabilities. So I think that the Chinese government is looking to maximize its resilience in the face of threats and interruptions. By the same token, Xi Jinping is making a big thing of China achieving a self-sufficiency in food production, energy, and so on. So I think this is just another manifestation of that general sense of paranoia.
The government of the United Kingdom views China as a strategic challenge, not an adversary. Is that the right assessment?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking semantics here, but essentially, yes. I mean, I don't think that the United Kingdom sees itself being drawn into a shooting war with China in the foreseeable future. But the fact is that China does present a significant challenge to the UK from all kinds of perspective. Not least because under Xi Jinping, China is seeking to quite fundamentally change the system of global governance from the one that we've been familiar with for something that's much more favorable to China's interests and would be seriously detrimental to those of the UK. We're seeing an economic challenge, we're seeing an espionage challenge, influence operations, all of these things are creating problems. But at the same time, it's not realistic for a middle-sized power, but like the United Kingdom, to imagine that it can cut itself off from a China that is so globally integrated from an economic perspective.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about the spying challenge in a moment, but on that subject of changing the global governance, what is the threat posed in terms of China's technological prowess? So it's not, when you talk about a threat posed by a nation, it's not just tanks and missiles, but chips, semiconductors, drones, for example. That's a view expounded by the US Commerce Secretary, for example. If technology is used as a weapon, how is China using it?
Well, China aims to become the global leader and standard setter for the next generations of advanced technologies. And it wants to do that from two perspectives. One is economic. If China controls the technology and sets the standards, everyone else gets to pay China for using their technology. The other thing is that if China does achieve dominance in this area, then that confers very substantial geopolitical benefits. Just as in the 19th century, the United Kingdom derived a lot of benefit from being a country that wired the world for telegraphy, and the United States achieved the same effect in the 20th century by being the global leader in information communications technology. So China sees itself aspires to occupy the same role in respect of the next generations of advanced technologies. And of course, that would give China significant advantages in terms of the ability to have visibility of, and in some ways exercise control over what happens in countries that are dependent upon China's technologies.
How far down that road is it, do you think?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, I'm often asked in the technology race, to make a comparison between the United States and China. I think it's still fair to say that the United States is still ahead in most significant areas, but in some the gap is closing quite rapidly. I'm not sure that's a really useful way of thinking about the problem anymore, because the simple fact is that China has now, I think, acquired a critical mass of capabilities. It may not necessarily be able to match the United States in the design and production, for example, of the most advanced semiconductor production nodes. But right across a wide range of technologies, it does have significant capabilities. And of course, where China has a very real advantage is in manufacturing. China has these deep nodes of industrial engineering expertise linked by state-of-the-art infrastructure networks. This confers a very significant advantage on China. So irrespective of whether China actually does overtake the United States, and these are the only two countries that matter in this contest, China is going to be a consequential player here, and what it does will have some effect on all of us.
You've recently written about how China spies in the Spectator magazine. Every country does, though. How does the scale and sophistication of China's spying compare?
Well, the scale certainly is beyond anything that anybody has previously experienced. And the simple fact is that there's a fundamental asymmetry of vulnerabilities here. Put crudely, there is a lot less that the West wants to steal from China than China wants to steal from the West. I mean, that in time will balance out, but for the time being, China's appetite, for intelligence about the West and the capacity to exercise influence in the West covertly is virtually limitless. There are huge resources being applied to this. And also China is able to achieve a kind of multiplier effect through the way in which it makes its technology available, particularly to countries in the developing world. That really gives them quite a significant advantage. In terms of sophistication, I would say that the picture is a bit more mixed. China's cyber operations used to be characterized by rather lax tradecraft. They didn't seem to be trying very hard to conceal who they were. We've seen a marked increase in sophistication there. When it comes to human intelligence operations, these tend to be characterized by a combination of quite sophisticated assessment of vulnerabilities and how to exploit them, but comes with a rather tin-eared approach to the cultural dimension. The other thing is, I think if you agree to spy for China, you might find yourself getting surprisingly well paid, but if anything goes wrong, you're not going to get any support or backup from them.
So how do they go about recruiting people for human intelligence?
Well, pretty much the same way everybody does it and has done since the dawn of time, really. That they look at, they identify people who either have or might have the potential to acquire access to useful intelligence, study them, and of course, with modern social media, it's orders of magnitude easier to do this than was the case before. We had modern information communications technologies, and then identify particularly areas of vulnerability or motivation that they might be able to exploit. Normally, they approach people, certainly foreigners, are not approached using coercive means, although the Chinese intelligence services do use things like honey traps in China and actually sometimes outside. But generally, the idea is, to work on positive motivation. it often just boils down to money, quite honestly, because China's ideology, in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, ideology was a factor. It's much less so in relation to China. So it tends more to be about money. I mean, a case in point, I think I cited in that article was a former CIA officer, Kevin Mallory. He was down on his luck, unemployed, behind with his mortgage. His profile on LinkedIn made it pretty clear that he had worked for the CIA and was desperate to look for employment. And the Chinese simply sent him a message on LinkedIn saying, "We'd like to invite you to China to attend some event, and maybe you could write a paper for us." And once they got him to China, the rest came pretty quickly. We're seeing now quite a lot of approaches to foreign students studying in China, where they're of course totally accessible, can be subject to 360-degree surveillance while they're there. And of course, these students in the main do not currently have access to what we would consider intelligence, but the hope is that they can be steered into positions where they can acquire such intelligence. And in a very real sense, that is the kind of holy grail for any intelligence organization. Get somebody young, feed them into the system, and bring them up through it.
Tell me a bit more about the breadth of the kind of tools, the agencies, the contractors that China uses both at home and abroad to carry out its espionage.
Well, yes. I mean, the fact is that, let's look at the cyber side of things, because the appetite for information is such that the intelligence services, the Ministry of State Security, and the military simply do not have enough capacity in-house to cover everything. So they are subcontracting a lot of their activity to cybersecurity companies, often set up by people who were known in the 1990s as patriotic hackers, people who got into Western systems because they thought it was the right thing to do to promote China's interests. And we've seen examples of these companies being contracted to cover an enormously wide range of targets all around the world. So that is, I think, the first thing. But it goes beyond this because China is perhaps best thought of as a kind of intelligence state in much the same way as the Venetian Republic was at its apogee in the 16th, 17th centuries, when covert activities, covert collection was kind of integral to the functioning of the state. And this is very much true for China now. The Chinese Communist Party was forged in a crucible of clandestinity. For the first 2 decades of their existence, they were engaged in a no-holds-barred, vicious intelligence war with the ruling nationalists. And that culture remains very much a part of how the Chinese state does things. So when we talk about espionage, we see a lot of activity being undertaken by individuals who are not formally part of China's intelligence apparatus. An extreme example of this was a couple of years ago, the United States started noticing a high incidence of Chinese nationals purporting to be tourists attempting to make their way into military bases and effectively seeing how far they could get. Initially, this was thought to be not something that was coordinated, but I think more recently the US government has concluded that it was more coordinated. And is just one of a number of examples of where China is looking to use the freedoms of an open society to maximize, to see how far they can push, see how far they can get.
And what was spying like when you were in China?
Well, there's not much I can say about that. I would simply say that China is what my colleagues in the CIA would refer to as a denied area, by which it's meant that everything imaginable is against you. The entire system is designed to ensure that it's going to be very difficult for anyone securely to meet, have contact with, recruit, and run agents within China. And I think that remains even more the case today when you have pervasive technological surveillance, facial recognition cameras everywhere. You've got a so-called grid management system in which all cities, towns are divided up into grids, with one individual being responsible for monitoring and reporting on all activities that take place within their particular grid. So, and of course, the ability of the Chinese intelligence services in country to monitor your technology, your phone, and other digital apparatus round the clock. So it is a very big challenge to operate in a country like that.
And how would you judge the threat posed by China to the West, and how good do you think the West defenses are?
Well, I think that's very difficult. The first part of your question is quite difficult to answer because a lot of the threat is, one might say, hypothetical rather than real and imminent. Things like, for example, China's theft of population level data sets. Obviously, it's not desirable for them to do that. They're doing it for a range of purposes. Some of these purposes may never really come to anything. So that makes it very difficult. But I think in terms of, I think probably the biggest concern when it comes to Chinese espionage, and I would add covert activities writ large, is in terms of their efforts to exercise political influence through a variety of means. At the end of the day, for the Chinese Communist Party, the overarching priority is to maintain the political and ideological security of the party, which means that they cannot tolerate any criticism or pushback against their system anywhere in the world. So a key imperative is to neutralize any opposition or criticism wherever it may occur. And we're seeing a lot of focus now on that within the West, using commercial relationships, elite capture, and more covert techniques, I think, such as seeking covertly to exercise influence in governments, in legislatures. We've seen a lot of this in Australia and Canada. We're starting to see it here and in other Western European countries as well. So I think those are, in some respects, greater worries than some of the more conventional Chinese espionage activities in pursuit of national security and national advantage.
And in that context of exercising political influence, when the current British Foreign Secretary David Cameron was Prime Minister, he famously coined this phrase of the golden era to describe relations with China. I mean, how did you react at the time? And do you think he was played in hindsight?
I do think that there was a certain element of naivety in that. It's fairly clear. I mean, I wasn't involved in government, so I can't really comment from the inside, but it seemed fairly clear to me that the concerns of the UK security community had not been taken into account when adopting this approach. That said, I can understand why back then, the government of the day, did look at this in terms of how the United Kingdom could derive optimum benefit from commercial and economic relations with China. And I think this is a challenge for any country that's basically not China or the United States, which is how when dealing with China, to reconcile the interests of the economic ministries and the security ministries, which pull in very opposite directions. And I think the short answer is that there is no one-size-fits-all single answer to this. Each country has to work it out for itself. And in this regard, policy will not be static. I think we will see the dial shifting to some degree from one to the other, depending on the circumstances.
How well do you think we understand China? I mean, you believe that President Xi uses nuanced language to shape perceptions, determine outcomes. How he uses it and influences people, for example, and our language skills are not very advanced in Mandarin. How well do you think we can really get a grasp of the Chinese ambition and how it wants to view the West? Do we understand it properly?
Not as well as we should, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I mean, I think the Chinese like to kid themselves that they are so difficult to understand that we're never going to be able to do it. I think a few years ago, they seemed to operate in the naive conviction that if they said something in Chinese but not in any Western language, we would not notice. I think they've kind of woken up to that now and realized that yes, we do. People like me do read to and listen to this stuff. We do take note of what they say in Chinese. We don't have anything like as much linguistic expertise or area and cultural knowledge as we should. Certainly not within government circles. I mean, there are efforts now. Certainly the intelligence community is working hard, and I think successfully, to remedy this deficit. It's not their fault. Let's not forget that for the previous decade, the intelligence and security communities had perforce to be focused on the threat from transnational terrorism. There is only so much resource to go around, but it's starting to happen now. But I think more widely within government, it's still the case that knowledge of China and ability to speak the language is not really yet valued sufficiently, is not something that gets you promotion and recognition in the way that I think needs now to be the case.
The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, recently met with President Xi, and he spoke, President Xi, of three key principles afterwards: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. The US is unhappy about the way China's supporting Russia's war effort. China's not happy about the aid package announced for Taiwan and the potential expansion of the AUKUS military partnership. How optimistic are you about any of those 3 points that President Xi brought up?
Well, I mean, this is fairly standard language that Xi used, and the general Chinese approach at the moment is if only the United States would stop doing all the things we don't like, your relations would be wonderful. I mean, the brutal truth is that the differences between the United States and China are structural. They're about values, about ideology, about different geopolitical interests and preoccupations. And these are not things that are easily reconciled. And I think both sides actually recognize that. Last year, certainly the first half of 2023, it seemed as if Xi Jinping was blanking the Americans, refusing to have any engagement with them, believing that any such engagement would result in outcomes detrimental to China's interests. I think he has moved off that. I mean, and in 2023, in the latter part of 2023, it was clear that on the one hand, the G7, on the other hand, the so-called global South were becoming increasingly concerned about the deterioration in US-China relations and respectively bent the ears of Biden and Xi on this. Since when we have seen a number of efforts by both the USA and China, so to speak, to put a floor under the deterioration in the relationship and to try to manage it in such a way that the tensions inherent in this relationship are not allowed to get out of control. I think there has been some success in that. It's more form than substance, but form can have its own value when it comes to diplomatic engagement. So I think what we've got is a kind of uneasy calm, an uneasy truce, if you will, in which nothing fundamental has shifted and is unlikely to do so in the foreseeable future.
And how do you think the next president of the United States will shape that relationship with China?
I don't think that anything fundamental will change. I think the Chinese themselves are looking at the forthcoming election and thinking, well, essentially what they're being offered is a choice between dying of cancer and dying of a heart attack. There is no good option here. I think they're worried that if Trump does come into power again, he will quickly default to imposing very significant tariffs on Chinese products and is unlikely to cut China much slack. If one looks at the sort of people who look as if they might make up a Trump-China team, these are not doves. These are hawks. So from that point of view, I don't think Trump is going to give China an easy ride. And if Biden is returned to power, then I think it will simply be a continuation and intensification of the policies that his administration has been pursuing in the area of technology, in the area of trade, in the area of Taiwan, the three T's that in many ways define this relationship.
And just finally, in your view, what do you think the West's security priorities should be in defending against any potential threat posed by China?
Well, I think the first thing is to achieve a sensible balance in terms of assessing what the threats are. One finds, particularly in relation to the United States, that people either look at China as the sum of all evils, so to speak. Everything they do is harmful to the United States' interests, or people in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, who want to have the closest possible relationship with China. I think there needs to be some kind of synthesis here that amounts to a realistic assessment of what China really is, rather than defaulting to extreme analyses, which are almost by definition going to be incorrect. I think the second thing is that we need to look at where our vulnerabilities are in relation to China and start to do some serious thinking about how we address those vulnerabilities and weaknesses.
Nigel Inkster, it has been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.